the fantastic speech made by Dr. Adesina. And I must say, I mean this from the bottom of my heart, it was tremendously inspiring for me. I'm sure that it was for you as well. The part that I liked the most was when he said that the best entrepreneurs come from the age of 50, 60, and thereabouts. That was very, very encouraging for me, very, very encouraging. As a matter of fact, I'm beginning to think that perhaps a career in politics might not be exactly the way to go. Maybe I will be an entrepreneur, and I'm seriously considering looking at prospects. But I want to really thank Dr. Adesina for an excellent presentation, but most importantly, for the way in which he inspires and shows us the great possibilities that there are and that lie ahead of us. Thank you very much. It's a very special privilege and an honor to have been invited to participate in this inspirational conference 2020 of the Redeemer's Land Solution of the Lagos regions. The Redeemer's Land Fellowship deserve our commendation for this very timely and relevant conference. And of course, the theme is galvanized for dramatic growth. I want to say first that my task has been made quite easy. I think a lot has been said already by Dr. Adesina in particular. The aspects of which I believe are inspiration. I will just concentrate on providing some possibly physical, some macro content for the various contributions that may follow. I think it's important for us to sort of understand things possibly from the perspective of the government, the federal government in particular. And I think that our star-studded faculty for this conference will then expatiate on some of the issues which I will later. So I'll just briefly refer to some of the latest developments in the Nigerian economy and some of our thoughts and plans going forward. Very recently, an article featured in the Newsweek magazine titled, and I quote, "Black China, Africa's first superpower, is coming sooner than you think." Africa's first superpower is coming sooner than you think. That Africa's first superpower, of course, is Nigeria. The central point to be made, that I was made in that article, is that despite Nigeria's challenges, Nigeria is the last major open market on earth. The last major open market on earth. And that, like China and India, its population and economic size will enable the economies of scale and attract international investment. And that's exactly where we're at. We're at a point in our history where everything is working in our favor. And where really, if we take the opportunity today, things can only just grow geometrically, as has been suggested. Just this week, the Spur Group, an IT company from China, indicated that it was establishing a computer hardware manufacturing plant here in Nigeria. Much earlier than this, in the course of the year, the Mara Group of Ashish Packard had also indicated that it would set up a manufacturing plant for Mara phones in Nigeria. Microsoft is setting up its Africa Center here in Nigeria also. All of these investments are pointing in one direction. And they're pointing in the direction of the incredible prospects that our country offers. And it's not difficult to see why Nigeria remains an attractive destination for investments. Even the insufficient, and I want to emphasize that, the insufficient 2.5 thereabout growth rate that is predicted by the IMF for the Nigerian economy in 2020 comes to about $10 billion. That's 2.5% growth. It's about $10 billion. And this is bigger, or just about the size, of some of the economies to which Nigeria is often compared in Africa. In other words, the scale of the Nigerian economy in African terms is such that even our relatively low growth is much bigger than several African economies. The point there is that what happens here in Nigeria will fundamentally affect the rest of Africa. And everyone is looking to what will happen here. It's easy to underemphasize this point. I just want to make the point just so that in making our comparisons, we're better informed. Rwanda, and sometimes we are compared to Rwanda, has a GDP of $8.7 billion as at 2018. $8.7 billion. The Federal Capital Territory, that's Abuja, has a GDP of $29.9 billion. The Federal Capital Territory. That's almost 3 times the size of Rwanda's GDP. Akwa Ibom State has a GDP of $14.2 billion. Bayelsa State has a GDP of $8.8 billion. Lagos State has a GDP of $90 billion. Rivers State has a GDP of $14.2 billion. Delta State has a GDP of $11.2 billion. So there are a number of individual states in Nigeria, individual states, that are bigger in GDP terms than the whole of Rwanda's GDP. Even Ghana, to which we are sometimes compared, is 65.5 billion GDP in 2018. That is less than Lagos, by almost 20 billion in GDP. The whole of Ghana, as compared to Lagos. So I found that sometimes when we make the comparisons, we are better off, in my view, looking at countries that have the same sorts of size, the same sort of talent, the same sort of attributes that we have. So, for example, we're making this comparison, comparing with India, with Brazil, with China. These are the countries that have the size, that have the diversity, and that have the challenges that Nigeria has. But perhaps more significant, from even a national perspective, is that our growth rate of 25.5% is about equal to our population growth rate, which means, of course, that we have a problem right there, because we really need to make sure that our growth rate is well in advance of our population. At the moment, they are roughly the same. But the bright side of that is that the era of negative growth rate in Africa will soon end. So we can put this distraction behind us and focus on our ambitions of a high growth rate. Another often overlooked part of the Nigerian population story is our huge diaspora. We have a large diaspora. We all know that overseas remittances are extremely high from our diaspora. Some put it at about $25 billion from formal sources. Although some students of the Nigerian economy will tell you that it's probably closer to $40 billion if informal flows are taken into account. So the diaspora, of course, does not only bring money, but it also is a source of ideas, innovation, and investment. And I'll give you one example. There's a company called Kobo 360. Kobo 360. It's a Nigerian startup that recently featured in the Financial Times. Kobo 360 was one of those startups that was in a group that I took to Silicon Valley in 2018. In July 2018, from July 2018, it began to aggregate end-to-end holiday operations, and it raised about $30 million in a Series A round, which was led by Goldman Sachs and Nigerian Commercial Bank. So not too long ago, this particular company has already gone into the holiday business and is already attracting huge investment. The founders of the company are two young Nigerians, Ife the second, Junior, and Obiozo. They exemplify the spirit of fitting into a globalized world. They were working abroad and they came home and proceeded to fill the gap in the logistics sector, specifically the haulage sector, using technology. They have now made it possible for providers of haulage services to find cargo for their trailers on return journeys, in effect, bringing down the cost of transportation of goods by half. The potential of the Nigerian economy is also being boosted in several ways: in agriculture, in manufacturing, in technology, and in the creative industry. The story of the increased rice production in Nigeria is well known, and I think Dr. Adesina already alluded to that. Today, we're estimating something in the order of about 7.3 million metric tons of paddy rice compared to about 5 million metric tons in 2015. And that is just this scratching the surface. Our potential is several times more. Basically, because we have today is in milling, and a lot more investment is coming into milling. Several more companies are investing in milling. With more milling, we can actually become completely self-sufficient in rice production. A little noticed phenomenon in agriculture is the use of technology to attract crowdfunding into the sector. These programs, and there are about 17 of them at the last one, there are about 17 different companies, different programs, that enable a wide variety of people to invest in agriculture without actually having to engage in farming or manage farms. So what they do is that they crowdsource funds for farmers, and given the huge interest in agriculture and the relative ease of investing through such platforms, we've seen a huge increase in investment in agriculture and subsequent increases in agricultural output across the value chain. So several of these companies, Farm Proudly, Farm Ally, Thrive Agri, these are companies raising funds electronically, raising funds on their digital platforms for farmers and for farmers. And people like you and I, who don't want to go to the farm, who don't want to go anywhere else, are investing on those platforms and actually becoming owners and then becoming owners of farms and taking dividends and profits from farms. This is an incredible new way of investing in agriculture in Nigeria, and we're seeing dramatic growth in this respect. The manufacturing purchasing managers index, I'm sure many of us are familiar with that. The manufacturing purchasing managers index. Now, this is used to get a feel of activities in the manufacturing sector and the outlook for the future. It stood at about 60.8 index points in December of 2019, which was the highest level since November of the previous year. But perhaps more significantly is the fact that all component parts of the index, such as inventories, employment levels, supply deliveries, new orders, production levels, reported positive growth. Every one of those indexes reported positive growth. This positive outlook for the manufacturing sector can be seen from what Leverage Group, for instance, is doing, which continues to make substantial investments in the Nigerian manufacturing sector through its subsidiaries, the Nigerian Bottling Company, and Better Glass, for example. The Nigerian Bottling Company will soon be commissioning its thereabout plant, which has taken a substantial part of our recent $500 million investment in Nigeria. While Better Glass, which makes the bottles for the pharmaceutical sector and for beverages like Coca-Cola and Starbucks, has invested another $30 million to expand its furnace capacity. The Nigerian technology sector also continues to hold out great promise. Just as Dr. Adesina has said, we're looking forward to a $500 million facility to encourage technology, entrepreneurs, and to encourage innovation in that sector. And Nigerian startups are already attracting significant income and get significant loans themselves. About $122 million out of the $492 million in funding for African startups ended up here in Nigeria. Well, almost half of the entire amount of money. Perhaps more compelling is the increasing use of payment channels within the economy. The value of points of sale transactions alone, POS transactions, is reported to have reached 3.2 trillion in 2019. 3.2 trillion naira in 2019, as compared to 2.3 trillion in 2018, an increase of 38%. While the volume has also increased by 153 million transactions, as a total of 433 transactions in 2019. With the registration of payment service banks, I think it's an important innovation. Now the central bank is registering payment service banks, and the increase in the minimum level at which stamp duty is payable is now moved up from 1,000 naira to 10,000 naira. We are set to see quantum leaps in the use of electronic transactions with the attendant positive effect on the economy. Our creative industry and tourism are also sources of encouragement about our economic prospects. The quality of offerings from our film industry and entertainment genre, Nollywood, for example, has greatly improved with films I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Wedding Party, Wedding Party 2, Cheap Daddy, King of Boys, etc. Attracting large audiences and reaping huge rewards. In terms of quantity, Nollywood is the second largest film industry in the world, producing about 50 movies every single week. The interesting thing is that the quality of such offerings, has improved very greatly. Air traffic passengers, for example, and this is also another indication of the kinds of movement in the economy that we see. Air traffic passengers into Murtala Mohammed International Airport increased by nearly 7% in 2019. Now, this increase could partly be ascribed to a more friendly visa on arrival regulation, and it has boosted arrangements to improve the visitor experience, especially with regard to transportation and hotel connections from the airport for business visitors and religious tourists. But I want to emphasize the point that with respect to welcoming visitors in Nigeria, especially business visitors, of course we can do much better. The airport facilities can be greatly improved. There's a lot more to learn in that respect. But I want to emphasize that part of our ease of doing business, part of the improvements that are made in ease of doing business is this visa on arrival. Some people have tried to backmark the visa on arrival policy. But I want to say that where we compare ourselves with businesses, with countries all over the world, visa on arrival is a basic fact of life. In fact, practically all African countries today have visa on arrival policies. So you get there, of course, you make your applications and all that. In some cases, they make the applications online. And when you get to those countries, you are given the visa. In some cases, you simply receive the visa when you get there by submitting your application. We must make it easier for people to come into Nigeria, especially business people, to come into Nigeria. The threats that we have are not from people coming in and looking for visas. They are from people breaking the borders in other ways. The terrorists who are coming into Nigeria and all of that, who we have to contact them, are not necessarily walking through the airports and showing their passports. Those are not the kinds of people we should be worried about. We can track those sorts of people. We can look for them. We have a record. The people we should be worried about are those that we cannot see. Those that don't carry any passports and are still trying to walk through our borders. One of the major challenges in growing our economy, and I want to emphasize this, is in creating and maintaining an environment favorable to business and favorable to business. And then the second challenge is low revenues. Low revenue. Our budget this year is 10.6 trillion. It was 8.9 trillion thereabouts in 2019. Aggregate revenue as forecast is about 8.4 trillion, with a shortfall of about 2.2 trillion. So it's clear that we're running a fairly large deficit. The reason, of course, is that we're not earning as much as we should be earning, or as much as we could earn. The sources of our revenue, the main sources, of course, are oil proceeds and taxes. The same rings true for the states. States are also not making enough money. Most states don't generate enough revenue in 1 year. I'm talking of internally generated revenue, not allocations. Most states don't generate enough revenue in 1 year to pay their bills in 1 month. And that is generally the case. I'm going to take a few examples. Adamawa State, for example, IGR was 6.2 billion as a whole year. In a month, it makes roughly about 500 million naira in Nigeria. So its entire IGR in 1 year is 6.2 billion. But in 2018 alone, its overall expenditure was about 177 billion, which comes to about 14.8 billion every month. So if you make 500 million a month and you're spending close to 14 billion a month, even if you're spending 10 billion a month, it's hard. You are making 2 billion. Benue State, IGR, annual IGR was 11.2 billion. That's about 933 million a month, just under a billion. What is expenditure was about 178 billion in a year. That's about 14.9 billion every month. So you're making about a billion a month, and you're spending close to about 14. Ekiti State, Ekiti State's entire year for the entire year, 6.5 billion in 2018, 6.5 billion. So Ekiti State made something about close to about 500 billion every month. What is expenditure was 98.6 billion. So it spends about 8.2 billion every month, and it makes about 500 billion every month. So, and these are, and I picked 3 states randomly, Adamawa, Benue, and Ekiti State. And the story of most of the states is that most, and it's not because we cannot earn more. It is because we are relying, everybody relies on the center. Everybody relies on oil. Everybody relies on the allocations of oil. I have told, I've spoken at various times to members, to some of our governments in some of the states. In the days of the regions, in the days, for example, of the Western region, all that they had was taxes and agriculture. That's all they had. And they paid 50% of that to the federal government and spent only 50%. And we were able to do the incredible things that they did. Today we have the same sources of income. We have better educated people, we have more businesses, we have more taxable products, we have improved technology for agriculture. Everything is better than we were 50 years ago, yet we are learning less. So it's important for us to bear in mind that the business of growth is not just about the national economy. It's about the sub-national economy. It's about each state determining to grow, each state determining to charge its own economic power so that they can grow. The finance bill, and this is the most recent economic legislation of Nigeria, and not many of us are familiar with it. The first of its kind since 1999 is in some ways an attempt to respond to some of the issues that are outlined, namely a better business environment and also better domestic revenue mobilization, as to say, better raising our tax revenues. The Act, as a finance act, has two main purposes with extremely beneficial effect in the Nigerian economy. The first is that it addresses the issue of domestic revenue mobilization. That's the issue of increasing taxes. Nigeria has often paraded a very poor record of taxation, poor record, very, very poor in terms of that. However, even while achieving this objective of this public sector, the Finance Act is also calibrated to encourage an improvement in the ease of doing business in Nigeria and actively fostering private sector growth. Now, everyone agrees that the engine of commerce in any economy are the small to medium-sized businesses. Everybody knows that those are the engines of growth. So for us, one of the most important objectives of the Finance Act are the specific incentives for small businesses. So today, the Act exempts small companies with a turnover of less than 25 million a year from companies' income tax. So companies that have a turnover less than 25 million naira a year do not have to pay companies' income tax. Companies who earn between 25 million to 100 million a year will now pay companies tax at a lower rate of 20%. So there's a substantial reduction of almost 10% to enable companies in that bracket to be able to retain more of their profits so that they can grow faster. With this in place, the Finance Act has now done away with the purpose procedure also for computing minimum tax for companies under CETA, replacing that with a simple base rate of 0.5%. For insurance companies also, there is good news. And let me just explain that. Before the Act, insurance companies were only allowed to carry forward 4 years of losses, even when companies in other sectors could carry forward their losses indefinitely. This anomaly has now been raised. Not only can they carry forward their losses indefinitely, the special minimum tax for insurance companies has also been abolished. So in this respect, they are to be treated like any other company, any other sector of the economy. So insurance companies have a big boost to them. To ensure better revenues from dividends and improve capital, there are also provisions in the Finance Act to mitigate the risk of double taxation. Before now, dividends paid out of retained earnings were liable to tax, despite the fact that such earnings will usually have been subjected to tax already. And this is now no longer the case. So now, it's entirely possible to avoid that because there is no requirement of that further tax on retained earnings. A similar provision has also been made in respect of fund investment income and dividends that are paid out to exempted profits. In other words, these sources of income will no longer be at risk of double taxation. To encourage early payment of taxes, there's also a provision, it's a business-friendly provision with the Act, which grants tax credits to companies for early filing of their tax returns. So if you file your tax returns early as a company, you get a rebate. If you're a large company, you get a 1% tax credit, while medium-sized companies will get a 2% tax credit just for early filing of tax returns. Furthermore, the regulation of the special impetus that is required for the infrastructure, withholding tax rates on roads, on bridges, on buildings, on power plant construction contracts is now reduced from 5% to 2.5%. So the withholding tax on construction of infrastructure has gone down now from 5% to 2.5%. So there is a great deal that is in there to improve the business environment, to ensure that businesses can do better, can earn more, retain more of their profits, invest more of their profits. And so, I think we should also very quickly talk about increasing government revenue, which is the second aspect of what the Finance Act has to do. It's a well-known fact that Nigeria's debt to GDP has always been very low. Indeed, it's one of the lowest in the world. This has itself seriously constrained economic growth and limited the delivery of this public amenity. Tax to GDP, very high, not debt to GDP. And this has always been very, very low. It has restricted the delivery of public amenities, which are essential conditions for attracting investments. The OECD, looking at our revenue statistics in Africa in 2019, puts Nigeria's tax to GDP at about 5.7%, and that's in 2018. And it estimates that it might be slightly higher. Our own estimate is very low. It says about 6%, which, considering the level of economic activity in Nigeria, is so low as to constitute a negative factor and a serious drawback for the entire system. This is also considering the fact that the average tax to GDP across 26 other African countries is about 17.2% compared to our 5 to 6%, which is about 11.5% higher than Nigeria. Our tax to GDP is also, even for external investors, they're looking at all of those indicators and they're asking themselves, if domestic revenue mobilization is so low, what does that say about the economy? So tax to GDP is very important. It's a very important index for the health of the economy. Another area of revenue improvement is the value-added tax. And so now, of course, you have heard that our value-added tax, again, notoriously has been increased. And if you compare, I think it's just important to compare VAT rates to that of other African countries. Ghana, for example, has a rate of 12.5% VAT. It recently reduced it from 15%. Cameroon has a VAT rate of 19.25% compared to our own at some point of 5%, Egypt 14%, South Africa 15%, Mexico, which is a combined country in that part of the world, 16%. However, while when you look at what we've done, we've said, okay, we're increasing from 5% to 7.5%. And what we've also done is to say that we are going to exempt those goods that impact the poor or have become a disincentive for small businesses. So we have a very long list of exempted items. Basic food items, for example, are exempted. In other words, we do not pay more VAT on basic food items. And this is now comprehensively defined to encompass all food necessities and avoid any ambiguities. The new Act has 16 very well articulated classes of food items, all exempted from VAT. Similarly, basic commodities like drugs, locally manufactured sanitary towels, pads, tampons, tuition fees in all tiers of the educational system, from nursery to tertiary, are also free from VAT. Also, as a palliative measure for micro and small enterprises, VAT compliance threshold is now set at an annual turnover of 25 million naira. For companies which are recording any turnover lower than that, they are not obliged to register for VAT or render monthly returns. So if your company is making less than 25 million naira, and that's the threshold, they are not required to register for VAT, and you're not required to pay VAT. For businesses above the threshold, the remittance, for businesses that are above that threshold, the remittance of VAT will now be on a cash basis, meaning that they will only remit the VAT charged on sales for which they have received payment. In the case of credit sales, VAT remittances will be due when the consumer pays, as opposed to when the contract was entered into. At the same token, the business can only recover input VAT that has been actually paid against output VAT that has been collected. This amendment helps the management of the taxpayers' cash flows, and it also removes the risk of businesses having to bear the VAT burden for customers who ultimately fail to pay their trade debts. So an upside of the VAT rate increase, which you must not fail to note, is that it will give additional revenue to the states. The states stand to benefit tremendously from the increase in the VAT rate. At the moment, the sharing formula for VAT is that the state government get 50% of VAT. Local government get 55% of VAT. That's the sharing formula. The federal government gets 15% of VAT. So an increase in VAT means an increase in revenues for state governments. And many of the state governments, of course, who are concerned about paying the minimum wage and also meeting their capital obligations will, of course, find that this is a very welcome improvement in the revenue side. Let me also briefly mention the new provisions on taxation of digital companies and non-resident companies. Before the Finance Act, only companies that have physical presence or a fixed base in Nigeria would be taxed. So you have to have physical presence to be taxed if you are a company, if you are a company doing business in Nigeria. So most digital companies that do not have a physical presence in Nigeria or physical offices make significant revenues from Nigeria from online activities such as advertising, movie streaming, online gaming, e-commerce, and all of those sorts of things from subscribers. And they pay no tax for all of the income they make from Nigeria. So now we are no longer using the fixed base or physical address for Nigeria. The Finance Act now provides that once you have significant economic presence in Nigeria, and that's the keywords, those are the keywords, significant economic presence in Nigeria. Even if you are not resident, if you are a resident anywhere in the world, but you have significant economic presence in Nigeria, you are eligible to pay tax. You are eligible to pay company tax if you are doing business in Nigeria and if you are reaping profits from Nigeria. The Minister of Finance is expected to define what significant economic presence means, but will be guided by what the OECD has already done. The OECD has already told us what will be the guides, for what this significant economic presence means. By and large, it means that what the tax authorities need to look for is whether or not there is evidence that the digital company has a sustained interaction with economic life in our country. So what the FRS needs to do, for example, and these people doing business essentially in Nigeria, and how they will find out is whether or not they are generating income from Nigeria, whether they have a user base in Nigeria, whether they maintain an active website in Nigeria, whether they have a volume of digital content generated from Nigeria. So those are the kind of guides that will enable us to determine what will constitute significant economic presence. So from the Finance Act, it will now be impossible for a digital company to do business in Nigeria and make money and yet not pay tax. I think it's also important to note what the CBN is doing to improve credit flow to private investment of the private sector in Nigeria. And this is important because the only way business can grow is by a good flow of loans to the real sector. On account of the reform of OMO operations and also the LDR to now 5% interest at 65% credit point. Interest rates have become much lower, and there is increased credit for the private sector. And yesterday we heard that CRR will be going up to 27.5% to control liquidity. But I think that where we are at, where we have at the moment the LDR at 65%, that at least is sufficient in terms of bringing down the interest rates. And we also see that already the interest rates on many of the fixed income assets have already dropped to about something like 5 to 6%. So we're already seeing a situation where now more money has to go to the private sector on account of the fact that there isn't that much to earn again, as we used to do. The double digits that were attempted by treasury bills have now, are no longer there. Part of the advantage of that also is that our debt burden is also reduced, because once treasury bill rates go down, obviously it means that our debt burden, our debt service burden is also reduced considerably. So there are some upsides to that. But of course, there are a few problems, a few downsides. At the moment, current account balance is negative, so there is a need to improve FPI flows. Those are foreign portfolio investment flows. There's a need to improve them. We've depended quite a bit on them, but we still need to improve FPI flows, especially to keep our reserves where they are. And with low exchange rates, of course, those FPI flows are not going down. But we expect that the economy will definitely improve, especially with the real sector getting a boost from cheaper credit. Also, with the signing of the big offshore bill into law, we expect enhanced revenues from the oil sector. And we think that this will be significant in terms of improving the capacity of the national budget to fund many of its capital programs. Finally, on infrastructure development, our economic competitiveness depends a great deal on infrastructure. It's not news that we have a major infrastructure deficit. That's not news anymore. So our focus in the last few years has been on investing in roads, in rail, and in power, and also broadband infrastructure. We have major road projects in practically every state of the Federation. Some of the projects that are scheduled to be completed in 2020 this year and 2021 are the dualization of the Suleka Mina Road, the Lorin Jeba, Mokwa, Bokani Road. That's also another major project. The Inewi, Oduma, Bo, Enugu, Buru, Ebony, that's Ebony also. Those are roads that are also completed. The Yenekwa, Okaki, Olo, Lepe, Grass Road, that's another major project with the hope will be completed at the very latest, the first quarter of 2021. Bodo Road, so many of us are familiar with a lot of the talk that's going around that. Some of the residents in the area insisting that they will not allow the road to be built unless they are paid compensation. But it's a very important road. It's a road and a bridge which goes across the Obo channel, and we expect that to be completed. It's a collaboration between the NLMG and the federal government. Then the rehabilitation and expansion of Lagos Badagry Expressway, and also, of course, Lagos Ibadan. And of course, there are also several ongoing rail projects. One of the important things to bear in mind about the rail project, the Lagos Annual project, is the end of it that starts from the Lagos port. That's a very important part of that project, because it is there to enable movement of cargo from the Apapa port, from Tinkan and Apapa port, out to the hinterland. That will significantly reduce some of the congestion that we're experiencing at the moment, especially the green rock and the Apapa area. We expect that should be completed late this year, so that the railway, the Lagos Rail, the Lagos Canal, actually begins from the Apapa port and is able to take a lot of goods out of that way. But it's very evident that government by itself, and in fact the federal government or state government, will never have the resources to build the required infrastructure across the country. It is impossible. Government revenue today and even projections in the future, government itself cannot do so. So there's a need to attract private sector funding into infrastructure development. That is the only way that we can work. So today we have adopted a number of innovative options. One of them is the investment tax credit scheme. This is a scheme by which a private company can get tax credits or reduction in tax to the amount of money that is spent on an approved infrastructure project. It will be paid about 50%. So it can take a 50% credit for the amount of money that it invests in an infrastructure project. And the president brought this about by passing the Order 007, that's the Executive Order 007, on road infrastructure development and information. So far, 2 companies have gone through the process to receive the top tax credit certificates. The ended energy, as I mentioned earlier, was the construction of the Bonnico Road with bridges across the Congo town. Dangote Cement also has got it for the rehabilitation of the local jam of Bagan and Kappa, the Lorry Road. 10 other local companies have applied for the scheme to receive 50% expenditure in tax credits. So the companies are set to invest in 19 road projects, measuring about almost 800 kilometers. And these have been prioritized across 11 states of the 6 geopolitical zones. I'm not going to spend, I think I'll just leave it at this point so that I'll give an opportunity also for questions. I'm sure there's going to be a lot to talk about power. Perhaps I'll get a chance to speak a little more about power when the questions have been asked. But I want to say that the prospects for the Nigerian economy are bright. The prospects are bright. The prospects for the Nigerian economy are bright. 2 things that we need to do and put forward. One is improving the business environment, ensuring that small businesses can thrive. That's a day-by-day task. And that's why we have the presidential committee on providing an enabling business environment better. And that portion of our work is so crucial. And it's a very detailed one. And we're going through it step by step to ensure that we're able to improve the business environment for the small businesses, for the small businesses. And second, it's encouraging private sector investments in all aspects of the Nigerian economy, ensuring that the private sector plays its part. The small entrepreneur and the big entrepreneur. Everybody has a part to play. And I'm certainly looking forward to the progress that we will see in the Nigerian economy in the coming months. And I'm sure that all of us here will participate in that progress. Thank you very much.